Of course, we're going to start with this little matter of this virus that's been circulating the world for the past 18 months that you may have heard of, and the fact that it's never going to end. People think if they just took the shot, they get back to normal. If they just social distance, they get back to normal. If they took the vaccine, if they wore the mask, they would get back to normal. Doesn't appear to be the case. This is a headline which went up earlier today. We're still in phase 1 of the pandemic, Yale University professor warns. This is Nicholas Christakis, who said in an interview with Sky Television on Monday night, to be safe now, because with the original strain, we could have gotten by within a much smaller percentage, but the virus has become much more infectious. And he basically says that the pandemic is only in the beginning of the end of the first phase, and that the pandemic is going to last until at least 2024, another 3 years at least. Quote, when the world will have suffered a lot more casualties, that seems to have been said with some kind of bizarre fetishist relish, than it would have with a better exit strategy. And of course, he blames the people who didn't get the vaccine. Not enough people are getting the vaccine, not enough people are complying. So they're going to extend this for another 3 years just to punish you. But wait a minute. The majority of people in most European countries and now in America have got the vaccine. They did roll over and comply. No, they're going to still wear the mask. They're going to still social distance. In Canada, we see domestic travel being banned for the unvaccinated, and they're going to roll it on. They're going to continue it for at least another 3 years because not enough people complied. Meanwhile, in Australia, where in fact I saw a video clip about an hour ago of Kerry Chant, that is the scorning public health official of New South Wales, who says you can't talk to your friends and neighbours because it might spread COVID, now coming out and saying that mask wearing, at least indoors, is going to continue for, quote, years longer, bearing in mind now in Australia, in Victoria, in New South Wales, in Queensland, in these other states, they're at least starting to lift the COVID restrictions, at least for the vaccinated. But now we see that the plan seems to have a factor of continuance that's going to go on for a number of years yet. Headline out of Summit News, Australia building quarantine camps for, quote, ongoing operations. Why are the camps being built? And this one in particular, by the way, is not even going to be completed until next year. So think about that for a second. They're starting to lift the lockdown restrictions in Australia, in New Zealand, having admitted that the zero COVID strategy is completely impossible, unobtainable, and disastrous. Yet they're building quarantine camps that won't even be completed until next year. If you thought this was winding down, then you can think again. But who are these camps being built for? Well, they asked the officials there in Queensland, and one of the categories of population who the camps were being built for was, quote, those who have not had access to vaccination. In other words, the camps are being built for the unvaccinated. Despite some states tentatively beginning to lift lockdown restrictions, Australian authorities are building quarantine camps that won't be completed until next year in order to prepare for, quote, ongoing operations and to house those who have not had access to vaccination. This is in relation to a 1,000-bed quarantine facility, and it's called Wellcamp outside Toowoomba, which is an area in Queensland, Australia. It's going to be fully completed by the end of March 2022. So you're talking at least another 5 months' time. They're going to roll out 500 beds by the end of December, according to this report. And it's going to be used for domestic travelers returning from COVID hotspots, which again indicates that those restrictions are not going to be lifted anytime soon. The camps are split into different zones and they accommodate singles, doubles, and family rooms. Yes, you can stay at the detention camp with your family members. They're nice like that. And they'll be patrolled by police and security guards 24/7. Queensland Deputy Premier Stephen Miles said the camps were for people who, quote, have not had access to vaccination. He added, quote, we anticipate there to be a continuing need for quarantine facilities. Bearing in mind we had the Yale technocrat, who I just mentioned before, who said the pandemic the end of sight of the pandemic wouldn't even come into view until at least the end of 2024. They've got a 12-month lease on the land for this new quarantine camp with an option to extend it for 12 months after that. Another 1,000-bed quarantine facility is also being built outside Brisbane Airport. So again, we've seen this massive tyranny in Australia. We've seen pregnant women being arrested in front of their kids for posting about a protest on Facebook. We've seen, as I mentioned before, Kerry Chan talking about people not being allowed to talk to their friends and neighbours. We've seen police brutality on a scale that you haven't seen in a developed country for decades and decades. Australians finally thinking that's going to be coming to an end. No, it isn't. They've got the camps ready for years to come. Meanwhile, over here on Airstrip 1, Sky News, bearing in mind here in the UK, or at least in England, the coronavirus restrictions have largely been lifted, at least if you want to stay inside the country. If you want to leave the country, you've got to jump through 20, 30 flaming hoops. But at least they've been almost entirely lifted in England itself. And yet we see headlines like this. COVID-19 New Year's Eve firework display over Thames in London cancelled due to coronavirus. But wait, there aren't any coronavirus restrictions. Why are they cancelling the fireworks display set to take place on December 21st? We've got football stadiums in this country full of 70,000 people. I went to a Sea Life Marine Centre about a week ago, which is underground. They ridiculously claim that you have to maintain social distancing. Everyone's packed in there. The vast majority of people in there weren't wearing masks. It's kind of blown over to a large extent in England, again, because the restrictions have been lifted. And yet the annual New Year's Eve firework display over the River Thames in central London has been cancelled for a second year because of COVID. 100,000 people usually attend the event. Again, we've got 70, 60,000 people attending football games in central London, in Manchester, in all these other major cities. And yet they're saying the fireworks event for December 31st in October has already been cancelled. Gee, why do you think that could be? Could it be because they're planning another winter lockdown? Surely not. We'll talk about that and more on the other side. Summit.news, don't go away. Of course, the rollout of the QR code, which was initially tied to the NHS track and trace system back a few months ago. That's no longer compulsory, at least in England. But we do have the convenience now of the QR code, which has now been ensconced as the new norm when it comes to table service when you go to a restaurant or a pub. Instead of having to queue at the bar, instead of having to fight for the attention of the server, the waiter at the bar or at the restaurant, you can just go and sit down, scan the QR code on your phone, get up the menu, select what you want to order, and pay for it all on your phone. Very convenient, apart from when you think about it, with the social credit score that we now have in the West, and bearing in mind, it's not coming, it's already here. We literally have hospitals in the United Kingdom saying that if you're designated as a racist, a sexist, or a homophobe, you'll be denied healthcare in the United Kingdom. That was passed last year. We have people in America and now numerous different hospitals being denied kidney transplants because they didn't take the coronavirus vaccine. Well, how far does that go? It's not coming, it's already here. And they're going to use the QR code, which everyone is going to get dependent on in this cashless society with bars, restaurants, museums, shops everywhere in major cities banning cash, not accepting cash. That's going to be the only option. But when you've said something spicy, maybe about the next president, Kamala Harris, maybe on Facebook, maybe you've done a tweet which some people deem racist, maybe you're no longer allowed to own a phone because you're on the social credit score blacklist, and then you can't use the QR code. If you have to use the QR code to buy and sell, and you don't have the approved mark of the beast, well, maybe you can't buy and sell. At the moment, it's very convenient, but in the future, if you're literally banned from owning a phone, if your cell phone company says, well, you've been banned by Facebook, you've been banned by Instagram, you've been banned by Twitter, why should we provide you service? just a private company, right? They can do what they want. No cell phone service for you, no phone for you, no QR code access for you. Now you can't buy food. It's a slippery slope, and it's already here in terms of literal healthcare. They're denying people healthcare because they haven't complied with the vaccine. And in fact, we have a headline about that today out of summit.news. Of course, we had the story last week of the hospital in Colorado denying the woman who's in stage 5 renal failure a kidney transplant. And 2 more hospitals demand mandatory vaccination before allowing organ transplants. It's all very progressive. 2 more hospital systems, the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals, have announced they won't perform organ transplants unless both the donor and the patient have received the COVID-19 vaccination. Again, you don't have the option to provide a negative test, despite the fact that people who are vaccinated can still spread the virus, and people who have antibodies are 27 times more protected than people who've just had the vaccine. No, the negative test option has been removed, which again goes to the point that it's not about public health, it's about mass compliance. The revelation follows the news that Colorado's UCLH Health denied a woman who was in stage 5 renal failure a kidney transplant because she refused to take the clock shot. Now, Cleveland Clinic has followed suit, as well as the UH Transplant Institute, releasing a similar statement saying it will begin requiring COVID vaccinations for its patient population. So it's not even whether you're allowed to buy or sell, it's whether you're allowed to have healthcare. And I linked to the article, by the way, from last year in the United Kingdom, because some people didn't believe it. They actually passed the new rule in NHS hospitals, government socialized healthcare, where the nurses and the doctors can deny healthcare to patients deemed sexist, homophobic, or racist, which, of course, by this point is basically anyone. There's a video I saw earlier today where people, I think it was an NFL game, began chanting F Joe Biden, and a woman in the stands complained that that was racist. So maybe in the future, if you criticize Kamala Harris, you'll be called racist because she's half Indian, half black. You'll be denied healthcare. You'll be denied access to the QR code. You won't be able to buy and sell. But it's not mandatory. No. Meanwhile, in Wales, they've just imposed the tyranny of the green pass, the vaccine passport, based off a completely dodgy vote. We've got a video on this, the truth about the Welsh vaccine passport. Let's go to this clip right now. Here it is. In what's being called a shambles, the vaccine passport scheme passed the Welsh Parliament by a single vote after a Tory representative was unable to log into a Zoom call. People in Wales will now have to present their medical papers as a condition of entry to nightclubs and other venues from Monday onwards. All because of a dodgy vote that the government won by 28 to 27. But one that should have been a tie if Conservative member of the Senedd, Gareth Davies, had been able to vote.
And Chloe, we still have a member who's desperately trying to get into Zoom but cannot get into...
No, Darren Miller, we are holding the vote.
No. What kind of democracy is that? What a farce. To be clear, if the vote had been 28 to 28, which it should have been, the vaccine passport scheme would have been defeated. The government would have lost the vote, but they didn't let him vote.
No.
Some of the blame also has to lie with Gareth Davies himself. If it's such an important issue, which it is, don't rely on technology. Stop being lazy and show up in person to vote. Nighttime Industries Association Wales, which opposes the plans and represents 100 venues in the country, called it a shambles and said there should be an urgent revote. A spokesperson said it was a democratic outrage that one MS who wanted to vote and who would have voted against the proposals could not due to a mere technical error. This shambles will cause even more uncertainty for our businesses. After they won the dodgy vote, the Welsh government justified it by asserting that England's going to introduce vaccine passports anyway, despite the fact that a cross-party committee concluded they'd be discriminatory and should be scrapped, and despite the fact that a similar scheme in Scotland completely failed on the first day of its intended rollout. Remember, they're trying to eliminate the option to provide a negative test,
despite the fact that people who are vaccinated can pass on the virus anyway, proving yet again that vaccine passports are about enshrining mass compliance, while moving the West towards a social credit score system that makes communist China look tame in comparison.
There you have it. That's what happened in Wales. If the vote had been tied, as I said in the video, the government would have lost the vote. The vaccine passport would not have been implemented. Yet because this one member had a technical snafu and wasn't able to vote, they just went ahead and implemented it anyway. And now, as of yesterday, anyone entering a nightclub or a large venue in Wales has to prove that they've taken the clot shot. Absolute purebred tyranny. We'll be back on the other side. Summit.news. Don't go away. So we've had a lot of hysteria and fear-mongering, as have you over in America, about empty grocery shelves, about fuel shortages, about rolling blackouts. They've blamed the pandemic. Over in the UK, they've blamed Brexit, despite the fact that grocery shelves in Brussels and numerous other European countries are also empty. And they've tried to make out that maybe it's a temporary thing, but maybe not. Maybe it's a longer term thing, and maybe it's part of the new normal. They're kind of shifting out the narrative of blaming the temporary reasons of Brexit, of the COVID pandemic, into socially engineering Americans and Europeans that empty grocery shelves, rolling energy blackouts, low energy in general, fuel shortages, petrol, gas shortages are going to be part of our lives going forward. This is not by accident. This is part of the Great Reset that they've had as a plan in place for many, many years. And I made a video earlier talking about this. We'll come back and talk about it as it relates to how CNN is covering it on the other side. But here is the video, the truth about the green economy. Here it is.
The UK shut down most of its coal plants due to global warming because fossil fuels are bad and cause global temperature increases. But because there's a polar vortex coming, marked by severe cold temperatures, we won't have enough energy to get through the freezing winter because global warming caused us to shut down the coal plants. What? If you're trying to figure that one out, don't bother because it makes no sense whatsoever. Being dependent on expensive foreign imports of natural gas simply to heat our own buildings because renewable energy is completely useless and can't meet the demand. We get a few weeks of the wind not blowing and we're forced into an energy crisis. Wonderful. We're trying to power a nation on glorified windmills and subpar solar panels, while China burns half the world's coal. China is tripling its capacity to make fuel out of coal, while we're freezing our bollocks off. And who do the environmentalists, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, insulate Britain? Who do they blame? Where do they say the problem lies? With us. Zero carbon policies are hurtling us towards 3-day weeks and pensioners dropping dead like flies with hypothermia, while China emits more CO2 than the United States and every single European country combined. And yet we're still to blame.
Blah, 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 blah.
But electric cars are here to save the day. Problem being, they shut down all the coal plants to stop man, bear, pig, and now our country can no longer generate enough electricity to meet the demand. Under a new law set to be brought in next year, your home EV charger will be switched off during peak hours to avoid blackouts. The proposed law stipulates that electric car chargers installed at home or at the workplace may not function for up to 9 hours a day to avoid overloading the national electricity grid. In addition to the 9 hours a day of downtime, authorities will be able to impose a randomized delay of 30 minutes on individual chargers in certain areas to prevent grid spikes at other times. In other words, the government will ration your energy use, deciding when and how far you can drive. Doesn't matter, I hear you say. I drive a petrol car. Not from 2030 you don't, because to save the planet, the government is banning them. So no electricity for the electric cars and no petrol for the petrol cars. Guess you'll be staying at home. Kind of like being under lockdown. And to top it all off, we're still being lectured by this eco-mentalist that we're not doing enough. An unelected activist who holds more power in Downing Street than the Prime Minister she's politically cuckolded. Meanwhile, CNN has created a creepy new phrase, before times, to normalise the sight of empty grocery shelves. Can you see where this is all heading? This is some proper third world shit. Welcome to the Great Reset. Government approved travel hours, carbon rationing limits, food shortages, climate lockdowns, rolling blackouts. Sounds like a barrel of laughs. Also sounds like a technocrat control freak's wet dream.
So there you have it. As I mentioned in the video, we've got China, which emits double the amount of CO2 that America as a whole emits. The biggest emitter of CO2 in Europe is Germany, and that's less than 10 times the amount of carbon dioxide that China emits. And who is Greta Thunberg talking about? Who is she chastising? Who is she lecturing? Friggin' New Zealand, a tiny little country which emits an infinitesimal amount of carbon dioxide compared to China. It's a drop in the ocean. It's a drop in the ocean for the United Kingdom, and yet she's lecturing us. We literally have a prime minister who's married to an eco-mentalist, environmentalist wacko who's pushing through this green economy, which is a complete disaster. Just look at what it did to Spain. 25% unemployment in Spain due to the green economy. 50% youth unemployment. It's a complete jobs killer. It's a quality of life killer, which is why we see in the UK now petrol shortages, gas shortages, because they've shut down all the clean burning coal plants. So we have to import it all from foreign countries. They're talking about a 3-day week. They're talking about school kids only being able to go to school for 3 days a week because they don't have the energy to heat the frigging buildings because they've shut down all the coal-fired plants. And yet we're being lectured. We've already shut down the entire industry and we're still being lectured. Meanwhile, as I said in the video, China literally accounts for half of the global coal burning emissions, half out of the entire world. And Greta Thunberg has next to nothing to say about China. She's lecturing New Zealand because everyone knows China's never going to change. And that's why they're going to become the new economic and military power. And yet they're not being called out for their drastically worse CO2 emissions. Of course, we know CO2 is plant food. The Earth thrived when we had higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, but the facts don't matter. It's all about you sacrificing your quality of life, while the technocrats can still fly on their private jets to Davos to lecture you about having a bath every single year. As I mentioned in that video, CNN uses creepy dystopian before times rhetoric to justify empty shelves. This is social engineering to make you believe that this is now normal. As I mentioned in the article, usually the out-of-stock percentages in US grocery chains, big box stores, are about 7 to 10% depending on the product. After the pandemic and in recent days, they've risen to 18%. They're saying despite supposedly the lockdown restrictions being lifted, that is now the new normal. Questions are being asked of CNN after the network used the creepy dystopian phrase before times to describe a time pre-COVID when grocery shelves weren't empty. So again, they're trying to normalize this. They're trying to get people used to this, trying to get people to realize or to hide it under the rug, the fact that this is how your life is going to be from here on out. As I mentioned in the video, they've literally passed a law or are preparing to pass a law in the UK where the government will ban you from using your home electric charger to charge up your electric vehicle at peak hours for 9 hours during the day. Now, these electric vehicles can't even travel more than a certain distance because you have to constantly charge them over and over again. Now, for half of the day during the daytime, that's going to be banned entirely. And they're banning petrol and diesel cars from 2030 onwards. This is the Great Reset. This is the total control of your life. Tax by the mile surveillance tracking to make sure you don't go over your carbon emission allowance. This is about engineered scarcity. This is about absolute technocratic control of your life. As Robbie Starbuck tweeted, they say that before times like COVID is equivalent to Jesus, absolute lunatics. Harrison Crank said, interesting way of saying we will have food shortages in Joe Biden's America. Another respondent warned CNN would use the term to distract from the Biden administration's incompetence and blame any problems on the pandemic. Interestingly, that tweet has been deleted, which happens a lot of the time when I embed it in an article. Sometimes it says, this account has been suspended.